Welcome back. Let's talk about the mineral needs of your beef cow. So what minerals do you need to be supplying? So if we think about mineral needs of beef cows, we can really break them down into two groups. We have our macro minerals and we have our micro or trace minerals. So minerals are needed in a little bit higher proportion of the diet. So we talk about them in percent of the diet, whereas our trace minerals, we talk about parts per million. So our macro minerals, one of the things to understand about them is that they have limited storage in the body, and thus they really need to kind of have a constant intake. And these are the minerals where we can sometimes run into what we would talk about clinical deficiency, where you might have cows who actually die, for instance. So if we talk about magnesium and grass tetany, some of you may have experienced that where they had low magnesium in the blood. But if we think about these macro minerals, we have calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, sodium, and sulfur are the macro minerals that our beef cows require. But some of these are actually sufficient in our forages. So for instance, sulfur. In Nebraska, we very rarely, if ever, need to be thinking about providing sulfur. And so we can mark that one off the list. Similarly, potassium. In fact, potassium usually gets us more into trouble than we are deficient, especially when we think about potassium interfering with the absorption of magnesium. It's actually one of the reasons why we have grass tetany in our lush, cool season pastures. There is one caveat to that, and that is when we think about dormant range, it is low in potassium, and we may need to be supplementing it. And we'll talk about that in a future episode. If we think about minerals that we really need to be focused on, then phosphorus comes up as a mineral that can be deficient in some of our forage-based situations. And we'll talk about that one, of course, in future episodes. Magnesium, and then sodium, which we can provide fairly easily through the form of salt. And so these are the minerals that we really need to be thinking about in terms of our macros. For calcium, we're typically sufficient in our forage-based diets, but we do have to think about supplementation relative to the amount of phosphorus in the diet. And so there are some instances where we may be feeding cows, for instance, in a dry lot with a high proportion of concentrates where we need to be providing some extra calcium. If we think about our micros or our trace minerals, we have cobalt, copper, iodine, iron, manganese, selenium, and zinc that are all required. Some of these are definitely more of importance than others. If we think about the two most common deficiencies that we see across the U.S. in terms of minerals, it would be copper and zinc, and that's kind of why they're bolded here. Those are two that you do need to be supplying in your mineral supplements. So if we think about of these trace minerals, which ones do we definitely not need to supply? Well, that'd be iron. Iron is not inadequate in our forages in Nebraska. And in fact, it can have some negative consequences in terms of how it impacts the absorption and availability of some of our other trace minerals. So it is not beneficial to supply iron. Now, these minerals can be stored in the body, and thus they don't really require that consistent or constant intake. Okay, so what's the goal here when we're thinking about feeding a free choice mineral? Well, the goal is to prevent deficiencies, right? And that is very true. In general, we have very few what we call clinical deficiencies, or those symptoms where you might see an animal, for instance, die. What we really come into is trying to prevent subclinical deficiency. So that's where really performance is being reduced due to a lack of that mineral. And in our cow-calf systems, the most common trouble would be actually immunity of calves. So our young calves are the most susceptible to our mineral deficiencies, and thus when we're typically feeding our cows, we're really looking at making sure that our cows are going to be able to supply enough to our young calves. A lot of times people think about our trace minerals, for instance, being important for reproduction of cows, and that is true, but in general, trace minerals are usually not the common problem with reproduction. Energy is usually a big limiter, and sometimes even metabolizable protein. Okay, so the goal of supplementing our minerals is really to prevent the subclinical deficiency. And that means our target is really shooting for getting into that optimum range where performance is no longer being negatively impacted, but not supplementing any more than that, because if you supplement more, it's just a waste of money. So more is not always better when it comes to mineral supplementation. We really want to hit that target of providing just enough to be meeting their needs without over supplementing. So for the rest of this series, we're going to be diving into, okay, what is this target and how do we figure out what it should be for your mineral program?